Hello, NAAIA community. Get ready to relive insightful discussions, gain fresh perspectives, and be inspired by the wealth of knowledge our community has to offer. Let's dive into another episode.
Super excited to be coming to you live here in the middle of the 2024 hurricane season to talk about something that is very timely and relevant, especially to all of us who are facing customers and trying to help them understand their risks and best prepare for them. So we will go ahead and bring our panelists onto the stage here so we can do introductions and get this party started. So again, thank you so much for joining. Thank you for checking in, everyone. Let us know where you're joining us from, and we will get going here with our panel. So as our panel is joining us, oh, I'm getting a little feedback. There we go. Okay. So we have our esteemed panelists joining us here for, again, this very relevant, timely conversation. So I will introduce them by name, and then I'll give them a moment to give you the quick bio rundown so you can kind of understand why they were chosen to have this conversation and the perspective that they're joining us from. So I will start to my left here. So Charles McDade, if you can give them an introduction, we'll go ahead and get it started.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Precious. Hey, my name's Charles McDade. I'm an agency owner down here in Houston. So we just had a bit of a hurricane down this way by Beryl. A lot of questions, a lot of unknowns in walking through this with some clients. And I've been an agency owner for 4 years, and 15 years I've been in insurance. So running and gunning and fighting the good fight, hard market or not. I'm happy to bring a little bit of that sales side expertise to the legalese that will be a lot of the conversation, I'm sure, today. So thank you so much, Precious, for choosing me for this panel.
Pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much. And I will go around the screen. Tim, if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Precious. I'm Tim Carroll. I'm the flood claims manager for Selective Insurance Company of America. We are a write-your-own carrier with the National Flood Insurance Program. I've been doing flood insurance since Hurricane Sandy, so that would make this, I think, my 12th year. It's crazy industry. It's been great, and I look forward to today's panel.
Wonderful. And last but certainly not least, Monique, let the people know who you are.
Good morning, everybody, slash afternoon, depending on the time zone you're in. Thank you for having me, Precious. I really appreciate the opportunity. I started in the claims world handling trucking claims for AIG back in 2002. So now I'm actually a TPA claims manager, primarily responsible for construction defect. I've handled some flood claims, some water losses. I've done a few things along the way. And I look forward to communicating with you all and learning, going, and growing.
Amazing. So again, this wealth of knowledge that's joined us here for this conversation to really drill down and understand what is the difference between a flood loss, a water loss. The reason it's important to understand those differences because that's going to be the difference between the primary property policy extending coverage versus a flood policy. And so to kind of set the tone for the conversation, we wanted to share with you here the verbiage from the flood insurance policy. So this is just the standard residential policy I have here on the screen. And, you know, there's no other ways around it other than to kind of just walk through it, look at it just so that we can level set when we talk about flood, which differs from how people, clients, insureds may use it in their everyday conversation versus how is it defined by FEMA, how is it defined by the National Flood Insurance Program. So here on the screen, these are the criteria that must apply for this to be considered a flood. And so again, we're talking about the overflow of inland or tidal waters, unusual and rapid accumulation or runoff of surface waters from any source, mud flow or collapse or subsidence of land. Again, that's a longer one. I'm not going to read that entire thing. You can see it on the screen, but the takeaway here is that there's a very specific definition, not only for when flood insurance is applicable and when coverage applies, but this same verbiage is what you're going to find oftentimes in a primary policy for property, because we're trying to avoid any overlap. So with that being said, so if you're wondering where I'm pulling this information from, again, this is from the actual policy form. You can find that online. So floodsmart.gov. If you visit that site, there's actually a spot on there as well. It's Flood Smart for Agents. Full of information, full of resources to be able to share with even the clients on, so that they understand that this is vetted, confirmed information right out of the horse's mouth, right from the government, so that we can be prepared. So we opened this talking about flood a little bit. I'm going to pivot and then we're going to come back around. So my pivot is going to be water losses. So we talked about what's flood. And so, Monique, I'll throw this to you first. Water losses. So other than flood, what is considered a water loss under a kind of standard policy verbiage?
Thanks, Precious. In the simplest form, water losses will originate from within the home or the building. That's the easiest way I can put it. So some of those common losses might be a burst pipe in the home, or a roof leak that's not caused by a storm or et cetera falling on the home, appliances, different things of that nature. So it's going to originate from within the home or the building. It totally different than flood.
Yep. So that is just right on the money. Like it's a quick way to just remember it. Where is the water originating from? How did it come to damage, the property? So same thing, Charles, what is the way that you kind of explain this when you're having that analysis and that quoting conversation with your customers on where the limitations are on one policy and where, a flood policy would kind of fill in the gap, so to speak?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, trying to figure out for clients exactly how to word it so that way, because we may deal with insurance 365 days a year, but when your client needs you, this is the one time where they need to make sure that their definitions, that their level set of what is covered and isn't covered is correct. So getting that right on the front end and walking through it with them is so huge, to your point. Right. So biggest way that I kind of separated out is kind of 4 different ways of looking at water loss. It's, of course, your sudden and accidental, right? Your busted water pipe. We had the snowpocalypse down here in Houston a couple of years back, where it's just that huge wind chill ended up coming, causing some frozen pipes, and of course, subsequently, those actually bursting on us, right? So it was a huge amount of water loss, although it did originate inside the home. Making sure that you have sudden and accidental water damage coverage with your expanded forms is huge. Your HO3s, your HOBs, and just really getting into the definitions of things, because companies are really putting a limiting factor on some of those because of how detrimental they can be on wood flooring, right? We go to the second, being water backup. Best way I describe it is things you flush down your toilet magically coming on their way back up. Right. And of course, the third thing ends up being seepage and leakage, right? Just imagine like a slow trickle of water coming through like a tiny crack of a basement, or a small amount of water coming through because your second story shower area ends up having a bedpan problem, and that accumulating over weeks of time, at times even months of time, right? And of course, those 3 different items, sudden and accidental, water backup, and seepage and leakage, are all normally pieces of your policy that are all outlined and specifically limited inside of the policy for your, kind of viewing pleasure, if you will. This is the time where being a professional is huge, and walking all of our clients through those particular topics, which brings us to, of course, the last not least, and the reason for kind of all of us being here, which is, of course, is the flood conversation. Of the way I describe it to clients is 2 or more properties, one of which being your own, and 2 or more acres. Heavy rainstorm, hurricanes, kind of all of those conversations. And just because you're not in a flood zone doesn't mean that water doesn't exist in and around you. So those are kind of the quick ways that I run through it and break it on down to make it as easy as possible for clients to digest that, since it's something that really needs to be explained specifically and set specifically, because expectations are the biggest name of the game here.
Thank you for that. And that's a really good point. Like, why are we having this conversation here in our NAAIA agent community about claim scenarios? And the reason is, and I'm sure, Monique and Tim will agree, is that as an adjuster, when we have to deliver the unfortunate news of a exclusion of a claim that's being denied, hands down, the very next call that customer is going to make is to your office. They want to talk to the agent that sold them the policy. They want to understand why or why not. And so we're trying to equip you with that knowledge and that understanding, not necessarily to, put on your ladder and your roof climbing boots and hit the field and settle claims, but knowing enough about where those divisions are so that you can, with confidence, be able to answer some of these questions, especially on the front end. So Tim, we were talking a little bit, we showed the verbiage on screen directly from NFIP. When you think about how do we, again, and I know Charles went through the high points, on flood, what would be something that a scenario where flood insurance would apply that, for example, I'll pick on mud flow. There's a lot of questions sometimes between what is flood and what's not flood. So if you can kind of share a little bit with us from that angle on the type of scenarios other than what people think of as flood, which is like a breach of a dam.
Yeah, it's pretty funny that whenever something hits the news that's water related, it seems to make its way across our desks here in the claims world. Like, what would happen in this scenario, right? So a lot of you may have seen, I think it was over the weekend, there's that house in Outer Banks, North Carolina, that wound up in the surf. So, would this be a flood? And another one that popped up recently is in New Jersey. There was a water main break in the street that was just dousing this house, right? So that hypothetical comes to us 10 different ways. Would this be a flood, right? It's water damage. It's something outside the policyholder's control. Is this something our policy would respond to? And it can go several different ways, right? We have to investigate the circumstances around that. So in this recent case, there's this water main break. It's dousing just this one house, and it's hitting the roof and the second floor. And that's not going to be a flood, right? That's going to be some strange occurrence that doesn't meet that 2 or more acres, 2 or more properties definition. And I know we want to try and leave some of the legalese out of this conversation. It's just impossible not to bring it back to the definition, right? But same sort of thing happened about 10 years ago in Los Angeles near the UCLA campus. They had a major water main break. And in that scenario, you could see this geyser go off in the street. It fills the street. It's running down the street into Pauley Pavilion where they play basketball and the classrooms, and it's creating that 2 or more acres. So yes, there's runoff from any source, again, back to the legalese. But there you can have that covered flood event because you've got 2 or more properties that are being impacted by this runoff from any source. Whereas in these other scenarios, when it's limited to just that one structure, we're not going to be able to assist in those instances.
Fantastic. Yeah, those are perfect illustrations of when it does and doesn't apply. And I love that reminder that, as a catastrophe adjuster myself, when we are handling claims, that's the very first litmus test, right? Is that we compare it to the language of the policy before doing anything else to make sure coverage either applies or doesn't apply. So that's going to happen before an estimate. That's going to happen before anything else is trying to figure out, who's on first, right? So we've got a question that came in here from the audience. It says, what about instances where it rains for an extended period of time over your area and creates floods? Is that covered by regular homeowners? So Monique, I'll let you weigh in on that because that's really at the crux of what we're talking about today.
I think you, excuse me, Precious, you're asking, or the question was, I'm trying to read it along with
when
you.
it rains,
If it's raining continuously?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in my opinion, it's going to depend on some additional factors. So are properties damaged nearby? Any other properties flooded nearby? I would personally say, where's the water damage coming in? So there's some unknowns. Maybe we can ask, or if you can kind of help me clarify on her question, or if you're looking at the question, I'm trying to read it here on the chat, but it's going to depend on some additional factors. If it's coming in on the roof, then still the same thing. If it's roof damage, if it's something other than damage that's occurring outside of the home, there's other questions that you need to ask in order to clarify.
Thank you for that
answer. I think Charles may be better than I on that.
Well, no, that's perfect. You gave the adjuster approach that I was really counting on you to give, and that is that overarchingly, when it comes to whether or not a claim is covered, it's going to depend on the policy verbiage, the facts of the loss, and who's adjusting it. So we're going to try to avoid blanket statements in terms of yes and no. So when I read a question like that, and I think that's where you're going as well, Monique, my question is, number one, where is the water damage? So are we talking about an artificial opening created by a storm where water's coming in now through like a broken window? Are we talking about rising groundwater? Are we talking about, I think Charles mentioned like backup of sewer, which when there's heavy rains and it inundates the system, sometimes those things happen. So the answer is a little bit ambiguous, excuse me, as it's supposed to be. That's why licensed professionals lay eyes on these things to make that determination. But by and large, if what we're referring to, and again, please feel free to repost a question if we're not hitting the mark here, is if you're talking about rising waters that are accumulating outside and now it's up to your doorstep and there's water pouring in from outside, to Tim and Monique's point, 2 acres or more, 2 or more properties, then you may be looking at a scenario where the homeowner policy would decline, because that's where a flood policy would typically accept liability and extend coverage. So again, if we're not capturing that right, let us know. But that, again, that answer was spot on. That's what I was expecting.
Yeah, I was kind of like, wait a minute. And I'm trying to see if there were more details on the question. So I apologize for trying to read at the same time, but I couldn't give a straightforward on that one.
Yep, no worries. That totally understandable. And thank you guys again for your questions. Again, the more interactive, the more engaging, the more beneficial it is for everyone involved. So next question that's here in the Q&A. So participants, if you want to kind of look in the Q&A section and follow along, it says, how are things like pipes bursting causing flooding in a property handled? So Tim, I'm actually going to go to you on this one. And I think my guess is you're probably seeing and reading it the same way I am. So I'll let you kind of respond to your thoughts on that scenario.
Yeah, so great question. This is one that comes up a lot. And in most instances, pipe bursts will not fall under flood because of that 2 or more acres, 2 or more properties. Some sort of residential issue that pops up, the hot water heater fails, or some sort of heat pipe or whatever in the house fails. It's not creating that general condition of flooding that we need in order for the NFIP flood policy to respond. The example I gave earlier with that UCLA, pipe burst and whatever, those are a little crazier. It's few and far between we get those sort of requests in from our customer to respond to some sort of major issue going on in their community. Most of the pipe bursts are really localized and just don't reach that bar for a general condition of flooding.
Thank you for that. And I know, Charles, you had mentioned Snowmageddon. Oh my gosh, in Texas a couple years ago. Still have a little PTSD. I was one of those households impacted with a frozen pipe that caused water damage throughout the home. And I will also add the caveat that what a lot of carriers asked when evaluating those claims, specifically with frozen pipes, and I know we're not going to go down this rabbit hole much, but one of the qualifiers was there heat in the home? Because oftentimes, they're going to ask you, does it have central heat? Again, was the ambient temperature inside of the house at least 45 degrees before they're going to extend coverage? Because if it's a vacant building and there's no utilities going to it, then even though something that on paper, the policy says there's coverage, there are additional caveats. And so, what fun is insurance without more legalese, right? But talking about, again, the sudden and accidental versus the seepage part, if you could, again, just revisit that and elaborate on that. Where do you see, again, what is your go-to explanation on how we explain to a customer, like the discovery, for example, because sudden and accidental is just that versus something that may have been going on behind the scenes?
Insurance is magical in the way that we set up the why, right? Basically, it's the best way I can describe it is, why did I decide to clean the kitchen, right? Did I decide to clean the kitchen because my wife yelled at me about 10 minutes before? Or did I decide to clean the kitchen because I realized she was having a rough day? Those two things are separate. The same thing happened. Water still happened, to giving this as an example. Water still happened, but why it happened, separate, right? So if you're looking at what's really going on inside your home, and let's say there's a busted water pipe because, again, why? Well, we abandoned and shut off all the power and then we left. It's like, okay, well, you didn't take all precautions necessary to make sure that the home was in its correct place. Now, if, of course, we're in a situation where the power was out, very much due to Houston being in a situation where power was shut off in certain places and we'd lost power in those, well, you did all you were required to do. You set all necessary precautions, right? Although all three of those particular options, you moving out, number one, or because, hey, that's just what you decided to do, or the actual power being cut in general because of just situations outside of your own control. And then, of course, number three, where is, hey, it just happened, if you will, right? All of those, at the end of the day, the same damage occurred, but why they occurred, what happened behind it, is where a lot of the expectations meets reality. And if we're able to do our best bet as agencies to make sure that we're lowering the confusion, and because we're lowering the confusion, lowering the litigation behind a lot of these issues, it's about level setting, walking through those particular topics and doing them early enough where you're actually able to make a difference. Now, those are all sudden and accidental ways that these things can happen. But let's just say it's, you got a new beautiful kitchen area and you ended up adding, I don't know, a new dishwasher for one reason or another. And that was, it ended up having a failure of a part and getting all over the place, but it taking time, dripping slowly, surely, right? And then all of a sudden that being a leakage problem because it's happening over, multiple days, multiple weeks. That's the best way to describe the difference between your actual sudden and accidental and that seepage and leakage is, well, did this happen all at once because of a particular event, or is this something that is ongoing a habitual problem, right? That kind of thing. If that helps really answer the crux of that question, I hope.
Absolutely. And I love how you broke that down in terms of, all at once or over time, because it's really that time element that, is the distinguisher. And so the follow-up question on there, you also answered as well. So in that scenario, no heat because the electricity was out, if you did all the things that you're supposed to do, so, that would typically be covered under the homeowner policy. What we're talking about is, again, if there was no heat or no utilities to the home, where that may be an exclusion. Now, again, just quick reminder for everyone who's on here, we're talking in very broad terms on purpose because we realize that you guys are joining us from all over the country, and so we don't want to go down this rabbit hole of looking too deeply into one particular policy versus the next. We're here to talk about the NFIP policy, the flood policy most specifically, so we understand how that is an important thing to offer and give your client a chance to understand, appreciate, and opt into, versus what they may have as an exposure should they not purchase this additional policy. So there's a question on here, Tim, that I want to direct to you that came in.
Sure.
And because it's referring to the existence or the location of a flood zone. So it says, so it sounds like if you have a hydrant near your home, you should have water damage coverage even when not in a water or flood zone. Is this correct?
Yeah, so I don't know that, hydrants are necessarily put you more at risk than, any other average home or building. But the question more so as it relates to where you are in relation to a flood zone, I think that's imperative. And that's what we hear so much from our customers. We have a really large percent of our claims that occur outside the special flood hazard area. And we hear from our customers all the time that it's never flooded here before. I wasn't advised when I bought this house that it was going to flood. And like some have already mentioned on this call, just because there's a line on a map, that doesn't mean the water knows that line is there. It's gonna go where it's gonna go. So yeah, absolutely. Everybody has some sort of risk of water inundation that they need to consider. Some common things that we see more and more are these communities that are protected by maybe levees or dams. There's a lot of aging infrastructure in this country that, because those protections are in place, they might be in a non-special flood hazard area. But as we saw in Iowa earlier this year, some of those protections may have failed, or they may have had to open some spillways and do some things that cause some flooding for customers that never thought they were going to experience it. So we love to be able to help those people that have that coverage. Are always heartbroken for the folks that learn the hard way that their homeowners policy might not be responding to that damage.
Awesome. Yeah. So the notion of being in a flood zone, I think, is one of those naming conventions, one of those words that we tend to use for the higher risk flood areas. So just to level set, and again, more information, the more you know, the better prepared we are, is that anywhere that has the only requirement to be able to buy into the National Flood Insurance Program is to be in a participating community.
Yeah.
So a participating community means that there's basically someone in the municipality who's responsible for like mapping and sharing information back to FEMA. So whether you're in a coastal area, if you're inland, if you're on the top of a mountain, wherever it rains, there is an exposure. So when people say I am in a flood zone or I'm not in a flood zone, there's a very small percentage of communities in America that are not participating communities. So just trying to break us from that habit of saying, I'm not in a flood zone. I may not be in an area where it's mandatory for my federally backed mortgage, but we got to be mindful because words have meanings, right? And so we don't want to relay to someone, to Charles' point, why didn't you offer it to me? Why didn't you give this as an option? You're like, well, you weren't in a flood zone. That has, written all over it. So moving through as the questions are continuing to come in, love it, love the engagement, everyone. The question on here again: rising water from the ground when the drains are not draining fast enough because the rain just keeps coming. Water or flood, Monique?
I'm gonna still say sadly the same thing.
More info.
You need more info, and it's unfortunate. I feel like I'm not able to answer the question directly because of that. That hat just says that's not enough to say one way or the other. I'm gonna send somebody. We're gonna investigate the surroundings. We're gonna even assess the properties next door. There's more that would have to be done to determine, unfortunately. But if it is just specific outlet, I don't want to talk in general, but if it is just specific to that property and it is rainwater, if it's coming up through the pot or through the commodes, I mean, there's just so many different things that can take it from flood to water or water to flood. So I apologize that there really isn't a one direct answer on that.
So I'm going to stick with you, Monique, on this next one. So I'm going to preface it with the how the question ends before I let you answer. So I feel like I'm again doing a Quentin Tarantino again. We'll start in the beginning, we'll go to the end, we'll come back around. Since I work in commercial insurance and currently working with a carrier that denied coverage for our client, the loss occurred after heavy rainfall, which caused sewage backup and water damage to the first floor of the building. The carrier advised the water damage was denied due to being considered a flood under a new flood redefinition policy. Our client is not in a floodplain and water was less than an inch in areas of the building. Any way to fight this? Any points to bring to the carrier? So my caveat is we're all on the same team, agents, underwriters, adjusters. And so when I see words like fighting it and things like that, communication and clarification are amazing, but as the agent, as the face of the policy and the point of sale, it's really important to set expectations that we're going to allow processes to play out. And so while agents can absolutely try to advocate and assist with providing details, documents, photos to adjusters, there is that fine line as far as commenting on the disposition of a claim. So that was my disclaimer I had to put out there for all the agent folks. Back to the scenario here, Monique, if that came across your desk for a reevaluation, what are your thoughts?
I tried to listen clearly to your points there. Less than 2 inches.
Yes, it says water was less than 1 inch, and it says that there was it's referred to as a new flood redefinition policy. So I'm not sure.
I'm not sure what that is.
Yes, I don't know if we're talking about a flood determination. Tim, are you familiar with that verbiage?
No, I'm not familiar with any definition changes as it relates to, at least the NFIP flood policy. There is some backup coverage available under the flood policy, but I can't speak to how some of these other products out there would respond to sewer backup.
So my takeaway here, because that is a lot, and of course we want to avoid speculating on any specific loss. So my feedback is to ask for more clarification. There should be the denial letter. They should be referencing certain language somewhere in the policy to support that denial letter. Providing that to the insured. If they want to ask for it to be reevaluated or appealed based on some additional information, there are processes in place for that. As the agent, and that's something that as a catastrophe adjuster, I made a regular habit of telling them, this is the outcome of this loss. Any questions, concerns about coverage overall, please sit down with your agent so that they can see what else may be available, to help you if there's a future loss that's similar, so that we might get a different outcome. So we're going to have to table this one as not quite answered because there's maybe a little bit of ambiguity in here, but my resounding takeaway is wanting to help the client, wanting to represent this to the carrier for reevaluation, or getting more clarification on why that determination was made. So we'll jump to this question in just a moment, because I did want to make sure that we have ample opportunity to talk about, we're seeing in all these scenarios how these lines are very fine on where the primary policy for the property, that's a mouthful, extends coverage versus where flood steps in. And so I wanted to talk about access. So accessing the flood policy, offering these quotes so that the insureds can opt in and opt out of coverage and understand coverage. Charles, as an agency owner, can you share with us just some best practices? What are some things that yourself and your office do to weave these into conversations along with the other property coverage?
Absolutely. I mean, it's such a big conversation when you're in a partnership with all of your clients, whether commercial or for personal lines, right? You're also in a partnership with those carriers. And the biggest partnership that you can have is facilitating the exchange of information. At the end of the day, for an agency, right, you are the translator for the consumer. Your job is to speak as much of the truth of what is insurance to a place where it makes sense, but not to overpromise. And that's the biggest deal here. It's allowing for those pieces of information to be facilitated easily, whether that ends up being because as an example, on every single home insurance quote, right? You can do one of my favorites, which is literally in bold letter for all of the templates that we have that go out. It specifically states that flood insurance is not covered by this particular home quote. And I send them, and this is a plugs, because plugs are shameless, because I love this particular part of the product. So selective for agencies, they allow for, number one, a quick link that you can add to your website, and you can actually see what the flood zone is. Of course, like you said, flood zone doesn't mean that it will or won't happen, but it just gives you a better idea of the certainty of that particular action. That allows for more information to be relayed to your client, which can give them a better idea of what to do next. Now, just because someone's in a 100-year-old floodplain, some people would say, oh, well, that's a low risk for me. Well, that's great for you, but for others, that's a little bit too much for us to worry about. So they would like to end up having flood insurance. So now, how do you protect yourself on the other side of the conversation? Well, make it easier, make it a part of your standard procedures, right? To actually offer flood, whether that ends up being by denoting at the bottom there of your quote that flood insurance isn't going to be added, and then adding a link. Selective also does this for our agency as well. Is a clickable link that allows them to get an FNIP flood policy, at least quoted directly into that link and email, which allows for not only for the conversations to be had and the level set to be had, but it also allows for the access to the policy quicker and easier than it's ever been done before. And if you're looking out for what's right for your agency, that's great. There's a lot of people out there that do that and that alone. But when it comes to being an agent on the Gulf Coast, my responsibility is to make sure that my people are taken care of, and the trust that they gave me is relayed and benefited in kind. So allowing for them to get quotes, allowing for them to get access to information and updates to those quotes and that information in a timely basis is my entire responsibility to not only my carriers, but also to those in the public that I serve. And I know that's a long way to run through it and to kind of thread that needle, but I felt like for this, it's just our responsibility.
Awesome. So as we started off saying, we are in the throes of hurricane season. NOAA has anticipated what is it, National Oceanic Atmospheric, what's the other A in NOAA, Tim? Do you I always throw that
Administration
off.
sounds
I
good to
think
throw on
so.
the end there.
I believe so. So they predict that we are going to have, I think it's 25 named storms. A certain number of those are probably going to be major storms. So there's a lot going on. So I wanted to talk a little bit along that same access point about the time frames in which somebody can purchase a flood policy. So Tim, can you speak to a little bit about accessing it and actually getting coverage in place so yet the insureds are ready for the season?
Absolutely. And I don't want to steal your thunder. I know there's a question here about getting access to a flood policy in coastal areas. So I just want to make this really clear to everybody here that the NFIP product is in place to give people access to insurance where historically, and we're going back many years at this point, it was difficult for policyholders to get flood insurance. It wasn't being offered in their areas, or maybe it was so expensive that they could not gain access to it. So, right, this is a federally subsidized government insurance program to make sure if you want a flood policy, you can get it. Right. The only qualifications, and Precious, you touched on this already, to gaining access to this insurance is you have to be in a participating community. And then to get even a little more technical, the building you want to insure has to meet FEMA's definition of a building. So it has to have 2 or more walls, a roof, and affixed to a permanent site. That's it. So if you're struggling finding access to flood insurance for people in coastal communities or wherever they may be, that's why that NFIP, the NFIP exists, is to make sure they can gain access to that. Now, the trick, of course, the timing aspect is there is a 30-day wait on new policies unless it's connected to a loan closing. So at the time the home is purchased, if it's being financed with a federally backed mortgage, which most mortgages are federally backed, they can gain access immediately to this insurance at the time of the closing. If they do not purchase at the time that the home is being purchased, a 30-day wait will apply. So that's really important, not just for new business, but renewing business. If there's a lapse in coverage and they want to reinstate that policy, well, now a 30-day wait applies again, right? So we really want to make sure if people are concerned about flooding, we're putting that policy in place now, especially with this crazy season they're expecting, so that 30 days can go by, and hopefully if they need assistance, that policy is in place for them to get that help.
Wonderful. So the question here that I kind of saved and I want to bring to the table now talks about, is it preferential to purchase a standalone flood policy versus a flood coverage endorsement? So this is for Monique. How often are you finding flood endorsements on property policies?
I can honestly tell you, Precious, in the states that I've handled, I have not seen a flood related endorsement. So I'm not sure if they exist at all. I've always seen them on standalone basis. So I'm not sure if that opportunity exists. So I apologize if I can't answer that one. But not Charles, but Tim, I think you had mentioned something earlier about that in a sense. I think you were mentioning, well, it wasn't directly an endorsement. You had mentioned something about the floodplains and the policies that or was that you, Charles? Excuse me, I could be wrong, but I've never seen it. To answer your question in short, that may be a Charles or an agent question, depending on the states they write in.
Got it.
In my home, as I think back to it, I'm not in a flood zone, but because there's a lot of water around my home, I had to explore. And I'm thinking as I'm talking to you, and that's still a standalone policy option for me. And that's here in Texas.
So I see that someone, it looks like Courtney chimed in here, that American Integrity does offer a flood endorsement, so that they may be out there. Charles, do you write with anyone that offers flood as an endorsement?
As a broker and as an agent, very sticky water, right? And I'm going to tell you why it's sticky. there's a lot of agencies out there that their focus is price, 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 right? And they're going over here and they're reshopping everybody at renewal, right? Now, here's the thing, the person that wrote the policy and the person that shops it on renewal can have an issue where they overlook something. Because to Monique's point, it's not always that every carrier has this endorsement or these situations, right? So when you're dealing with clients, whether personal lines or for the commercial side, they have to know and remember, as there are different people that have access to that policy or wanting to shop it, that the flood is in there. I had a problem where a client left my agency, and I was trying to call her to follow up with her, and she canceled her policy, went with another carrier for what she thought was $600 less, right? But it turns out it was $1,600 more because she'd canceled her flood insurance policy that was attached to this. So where I'm saying that it can occur, it's just there must be a consistent way that it's notated and denoted to make sure that you're doing the right thing by your customers, and so that in reshopping, nothing gets lost and expectations don't get all of a sudden unmet because of this bundling and slapping on of it. If that makes it a little bit easier. And to Monique's point, she's in claims and she's seen and walked and done a lot of things. And if that's sticky water for what she's experienced, I can promise you that when it comes down for the claim to be settled and done, it's also going to be sticky water for you walking through what is and isn't covered underneath this policy where you slapped on their version of flood.
So I'll add one final thought to that, and thank you so much, Charles. That makes perfect sense in terms of making sure that if you have to move a customer, that you're able to move them to something comparable when this isn't a commonplace thing. So Don, thank you so much for your comment on here. He says several carriers offer an endorsement to a property policy, but you would definitely want to check the definition and the coverage because that product may not be the best option for the customer based on coverage limitations. And so that kind of feeds into where I was going as well in terms of having separate policies is when it comes to loss runs, loss severity, and loss frequency and loss ratios. Lots of loss info, right? So if you've got it bundled together, for example, and there was a flood loss and it was a sizable flood loss, that's still going to go into that bucket of losses paid out under your property policy. And come renewal or non-renewal, right, that's going to be all attached versus a standalone policy. If there's a loss there, it's not going to attach to that property policy in terms of losses paid out. So that was way more technical than I wanted to do today. But these are all, again, that was the question, food for thought there in terms of the benefits of one or the other. So one, because time flies when you're having fun. And I'm loving that we were able to get to so many of these questions and takeaways so that people can really have a better understanding, not just for yourself, but so you can be a better advocate for your insureds. And so I do want to talk a little bit about the differences. So we talked a lot about where the line falls, coverage and not. Tim, if you can kind of walk us through some of the things that you have found from a coverage standpoint, for example, the existence of additional living expenses, ACV versus replacement cost, things like that. So we're not just talking about which policy is covering it, but we're also talking about what the loss settlement is on these.
Yeah, so additional living expenses is huge. Unfortunately, that's not something that's currently offered under the National Flood Insurance Program. We are going to specifically deal with that direct physical loss buyer from flood, right? So there has to be some sort of physical change to the property. The policy is really strict about trying to pay for or not pay for avoidable damage, right? So, those mold questions come up a lot. If it's within the customer's power that they could have mitigated after the loss, we want to make sure those things aren't being paid for. Also, they're going to have a slightly different experience when it comes to the claims process, because again, this is not run at the state level. This is the federal insurance product. So some of these rules that work differently in different states for their insurance requirements aren't going to apply to the National Flood Insurance Program. The policyholder doesn't have the ability to assign their claim to somebody. So there is no assignment of benefits in the National Flood Insurance Program. We issue payments to our policyholders, and then if appropriate, we also include their lender, but we are not making direct payments to their vendors, their public adjuster, their attorney, anything like that. So it can be a very different experience than what they might be used to dealing with in another line of insurance.
Wonderful. So as we're kind of coming up on time, there's another question that was posted here about specific peril coverage, such as ENS. And we know that there's the existence because, of course, the NFIP has caps on residential properties, commercial properties, and so excess flood is a product that is out there. Private flood is a product that is out in the marketplace too. So in terms of, securing coverage, of course, NFIP, I was watching, I think I read in the news last week that FEMA just announced that they have already depleted their emergency response money for this season. And so those who are without coverage, if they're waiting for an emergency declaration and FEMA money to come to the rescue, yeah, you might want to go on whatever news site you prefer. You read up on that because we are literally in August. And they're telling us now that they're beyond their budget. So lightning round, last thoughts, words of advice, encouragement for these agents. I know we've thrown a lot at you. So we'll start with Tim, Monique, and then Charles to close this out before Jeff gives us closing remarks.
Yeah, so real quick, I'll just touch on that disaster assistance. A lot of folks think they can rely on that. Hopefully, if they're in need, the president does issue a disaster declaration and provides access to those funds. But that is a real gamble, right? And I don't think people want to gamble with their most precious asset, their home, right? So, and then even if they do gain access to disaster assistance, a lot of times it's either very minimal or will come in the form of those SBA loans that are loans, right? That's going to have to be paid back. So, we hope we have more people insured with flood insurance, so they're not in a position where they're hoping that somebody will help them. They'll actually have a policy in place, a contract that they'll make good on. So I'll leave it with that.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, my turn. So I'll just say two things for agents. Never have I ever been an agent, but one of the things that I believe will help out, and I feel like Charles does a great job at this, explaining, you may leave us to go to XYZ thinking that you're saving some money, but, kind of show your customers where to find that verbiage in. Hey, I'm not just trying to keep your business. When you go to this other company, make sure you read this section right here, because 9 out of 10 is going to say the same thing if in fact you're getting the coverage that you need. But nevertheless, for me, I know my questions, I've had to ask for more info. I will say, don't be afraid to think outside of the box. I handled the winter storm in Massachusetts a few years back, and there's a lot of snowbirds. And so my adjuster denied the claim based on the surface. And certainly she thought, or you would think that she'd ask all the pertinent questions. Snowbird doesn't necessarily mean that you didn't have access to turning utilities on and off and adjusting the thermostat from your phone these days. So once that denial came in, of course, the complaint, because Snowbird's like, look, what do you mean? No coverage, home unoccupied, blah, blah, blah. And all the things that were quote unquote correct, outside that box helped on that particular one. And that's where, different thoughts come into play. Hey, look, Judy, did you think about asking this, this, and this? Get a picture of their thermostat. If it is one of those that you can adjust from home, maybe that's what they did. Just ask extra questions before you are denying a claim, or if you have an adjuster that has denied something, don't be afraid to sit down. Kind of, I love how Precious put it earlier. This is one team in a sense, right? Because the ultimate goal is to protect and serve the customers that the policies are being issued to, or that the coverage is being afforded by. So anyways, sorry that I couldn't provide more direct answers, but just ask more probing questions when it comes to a claim that's not being paid in the manner you think it should be.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Charles?
Yes, no, and again, thank everyone for their input and conversation, because so much of this is needed. Being on the same team, it's being an old football player myself. I'm like, hey, when the offense isn't talking to the defense or the special teams, it's when we start having miscommunications, right? So if we're going to really talk through what is required from each and every one of us, it's going to be, there's a reason why lawyers are needed in the event of like issues occurring and like legal problems, right? Think of this as like a contractual issue. You want knowledgeable representation, okay? Now, where you can get that from an independent adjuster, right? Or you can get that if your agent's able to have the conversation, not promising one thing's going to be done or another, but at least asking the pertinent questions to be able to point them in the correct direction. Because sometimes when our clients are in the middle of something, they're going to speak a little bit more freely and a little bit more loosely on what is actually going on, and can cause a denial, not because anything, the facts weren't different. It's just a uninformed interpretation may be slightly different than what it would be if there was a knowledgeable representation available. So be that leader in your community, for your office, for your agency. Connect with the right carrier partners that excel in delivering that particular service, that deliverable. Once you're able to actually do that, I think that is the biggest final thought. Lean on your product and conversational experts for their betterment.
Amazing. So thank you so much to everyone who spent this time with us. Hopefully you got some answers, some additional resources, some things you can refer to, some best practices. Really communication is key. I think that's what I'm really hearing from everyone: communication and education.
Thank you for watching this flashback episode with NAAIA. We appreciate your time and hope you found the insights valuable. Stay tuned for more enriching content. Until next time, thank you for being a part of the NAAIA community.